Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa. Wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Amma ba'du fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ista'inu bis sabri was salah. Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. In this verse, Allah Azza wa Jal instructs us, in fact, to take assistance with patience and salah. Once Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma was traveling and he received the news of a death, and he dismounted and he performed a couple of rakats of salah, and then he commented, he says, we've done what Allah commanded us to do, and he again mounted his animal and continued his journey. So salah is actually a support in difficult times. And as for sabr, it has the general meaning of patience. Sometimes the word sabr is used to describe the worship of ibadah as well. So as we pass through these weeks and now months, and we can see a glint of hope that inshallah things will gradually begin to ease and come closer to normal, it's important that we continue to persevere and to sort of hold our ground. So everyone has unique circumstances, and everyone has different challenges at this point in time. For the many, alhamdulillah, it's become a bit of a new routine and people are becoming accustomed. For many, on the other hand, there are all sorts of challenges, and these challenges include not being able to see near and dear ones, not being able to participate in funerals and janazas. And I'm sure by now everybody will have been touched with a janaza, a death here and there, perhaps in a different town or neighborhood, or even locally, a janaza which you would certainly have attended, or a family who you would have visited for condolences, or a sick person that you would have sat by the bedside of. And in all of these scenarios, you find that you have to stay on your own, and you can't meet these people, you can't give them any time. And the consequence is that it's beginning to have an impact on people's sense of well-being, this need for connection and interaction, to be with people, the people that you care for, the people that are part of your life. So this is the time now for us to be patient and for us to remember the examples of the Anbiya alayhimus salatu wassalam. And believe me, you will find examples like this in so many of the Anbiya alayhimus salam. When Adam alayhi salatu wassalam and Hawa alayhi salam were put down on earth from Jannah, they were lowered onto the earth. Initially they were separate and they wandered alone. So on the one hand, there was the distress of Allah Azza wa Jal being displeased. Second, there was the distress of losing the honor and the pleasures of Jannah. And third, there was the distress of walking about and wandering an earth which was uninhabited by other human beings. And fourth, there was the absence of each other's company. So this was a long, long time. And then we can move on. We can think of Nuh alayhi salatu wassalam. When the floods hadn't come, 950 years, he was very much on his own. His whole people, including his wife, opposed him, his son. There were very, very few people who accepted the shahada at the hands of this great prophet of Allah, Ulul Azm, from one of the senior prophets, Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. And then after the flood as well, the only people that survived were the ones who were on the ship, on the ark, with Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. And we can carry on. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam takes the world on single-handedly. Namrud is one of those kings whose domain extended to all corners of the earth. And he was the one who is responsible for putting Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam into the fire, from which Allah protected him. But the point here is Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam was alone at this time, and his father disowned him and told him to distance himself from him and not to talk to him. And Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, it was in his old age that Allah granted him Ismail and Ishaq. So a prolonged part of his life was spent in a sense of in a lonely situation. There was nobody else who shared the iman that he had, and he was this beacon of light for so long. And then we move on and we can look at the examples of other Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam. One of the particular attributes of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam is, despite his jalal, he was of he was very patient with his people. Banu Israel tested him to the extreme, to the limits, and they accused him of all sorts of situations which were very painful for Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. And that's why Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ آذَوْا مُوسَى. Don't be like those, O believers, who cause suffering. Don't you cause suffering to your Prophet as the people who did cause suffering to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. So his was a lonely vocation as well, and this is how it is for the Anbiya alayhi salam. He goes to Tur Sina to receive revelation, and when he returns, his people have begun to worship the calf made out of the gold and jewelry of the Israelites. And we can go on. Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, his final moments are moments of persecution, and they're after his life, and they want to crucify him. But Allah Azza wa Jal raises him up, life and soul, physically into the heavens, alive. And another man is given the features of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, and he is put to the cross, to the crucifix, on behalf of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, or in lieu of him. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, so Isa alayhi salam is an oppressed prophet. When he leaves this earth, his people are after him. The numbers of people who have not taken the Shahada and have rejected him and have accused him and slandered him and his mother of falsehood and indecency. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, each step of the way, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam's lonely childhood, the father passes away, Abdullah passes away when Amina is expecting, and Amina passes away on a journey when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam is a small boy, and then his grandfather passes away, and then later on his uncle passing away of Abu Talib when the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba are confined to the valley of Abu Talib, Shaykh Abu Talib, when the children are heard crying and the Sahaba are passing time chewing leaves, nothing to eat, and when they have a movement, rather than the normal situation, their stools are described like the pellets of goats, because there's nothing to eat, dried leaves to chew. And this is a prolonged amount of time until the sanction is lifted and they're allowed once again to trade with the people of Mecca. And so there are so many examples. We're talking about months and years here. So this is the norm. And then there's the other type of solitude, which I've referred to earlier in these past days. This is optional solitude for spiritual progression. And this was also a practice of the Anbiya. Musa alayhi salam's 40-day i'tikaf, Tur Sina, Rasulullah sallallahu going to Ghar Hira for prolonged amounts of time before bi'tha, before first revelation, to devote his time in isolation to the worship of Allah on the mountain of Nur in Ghar Hira. So Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam's time in prison and the years he spent there. So the point here is that as we go through these days and weeks, there's plenty to reflect upon. And one point I'd make here, before we come to some of the questions, a major source of reassurance and empowerment is actually not sabr, not patience, but shukr. And the ulama say that shukr is greater than sabr. And how can we do shukr in these moments? Well, we can do shukr for the past ni'mas of Allah, a lifetime of ni'mas and ease. And when we think about them with gratitude, rather than missing those ni'mas, so that we begin to despair, we are actually closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. So we can spend these days and weeks in acknowledgement of past favors. Oh Allah, we thank you for being able to come to the masajid, being able to attend the Haramain Sharifain, being able to travel, being able to go around the world, visit people, and all the different ni'mas which Allah has given us, which we can think of, which were present before the lockdown and in lockdown as well. Look at the situation of the millions in the world who don't have the easy means. It may be the case that you have to queue for your groceries, but at least you're allowed to queue for your groceries. You're allowed out of your house, and at least there are groceries on the shelves. Look at the panic buying at the beginning of lockdown and how people were afraid that there wouldn't be enough to get by. And so all the pasta disappeared from the shelves, and all the flour disappeared, and all the sort of toilet paper disappeared, and on and on. And what happened subsequently? What happened is the the stock, the supply chain continued, and Allah Azza wa Jal continued to provide. And for the majority, people are eating as well now as they ever did. So there's plenty to focus on with a positive attitude. And as we sort of move into the final days and nights of Ramadan, these are opportunities to seize in which we ought not to let ourselves be distracted by other things and to focus on the spiritual world, which is more expansive than the physical one. Ji.
First question I have from yesterday. I've heard that you should only wear a black or dull colours for abayas. Is this true?
I've heard that you should only wear a black or dull colours for an abaya. Is this true? Look, the purpose of an abaya, if we look at the time of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, the ladies in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's wives, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's daughters, and other ladies amongst the Sahaba, the manner in which they would conceal themselves and cover themselves when the ruling for hijab came down would be with a very, very large sheet. A very large sheet, which they would wrap around their body in such a way that everything was covered except their eyes, so they could find, they could watch, they could see where they were going. Their faces would be covered. And so what then happened is, as Islam spread through the world, there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of Muslims developed based on different traditions. They developed various types of garments which were conducive. The Arab women observe their hijab. You can look, on the other hand, at how Turkish women observe their hijab. You can look at how subcontinental women observe theirs. Afghani women observe theirs. And the Russian women observe theirs. And you'll find similarities across the spectrum, the Europeans and the Americans, of course. So the whole world over. The point here is that it's about the more modesty, the better. And this is about loose clothing. It's about clothing which is thick enough that you can't see through it. And it's about clothing which is sufficient to cover you thoroughly. And with reference to color, the important point is that it mustn't be something which attracts undue attention. A woman who is observing hijab wants to be seen as a modest woman. And this is in the Quran. It's very fascinating, the language of the Quran. You would think, wouldn't you, that with hijab, the words would be that a woman does hijab so she's not recognized. But the Quran doesn't say that. The Quran says, يُدْنِينَ عَلَيْهِنَّ مِنْ جَلَابِيبِهِنَّ أَيْ يُعْرَفْنَ فَلَا يُؤْذَيْنَ, so that they can be recognized, so that no one will annoy them. Now, the recognition here is to be recognized in terms of your values, to be recognized as a chaste and modest woman who doesn't want other people to annoy her because she's a woman, and to try to attract her and to try to distract her. She doesn't want that. So she's making a statement with her clothing that, look, because I'm a woman, don't try to approach me because you're not going to be welcome. That's her statement with her hijab. I will choose who I want to interact with. And this is very interesting. There's been some questions coming in about feminism. The feminine message, what is it? It's about the fact that women should not be sexualized and seen as sexual objects. This is one of the messages of feminism. Another, that they shouldn't be oppressed by men. Well, it's interesting that the feminist movement started in Europe, in America. We look at its history. In Islam, we didn't have this problem. There's never been. Now, if we see elements of this in the Islamic world, it's because of the movement starting from here and moving into those countries. And it's less about Islam per se, it's more about a move towards liberal values. So if we look at the historic, Rasulullah was the first to stand up for women. Before Islam, women would be inherited. And we see examples of the same. Women, there was actually an intellectual debate amongst the religious classes in Europe in the medieval era in Europe about women were actually actual human beings or not, or were they like animals and livestock. And so in the Arab world too, women would sometimes be inherited when their husbands would die, and they would be inherited as wives, sometimes by their own sons and the sons of the husbands, and they wouldn't have a share in inheritance. They were not entitled to their own their financial status wasn't recognized, they'd be oppressed in this sense. And in particular, orphans from amongst females. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, he completely turned the culture around. And till this day, if you go to Makkah, you can see the graveyards in which, when you go for ziyarat, the places are pointed out where girls used to be buried in the Jahili period. And the Prophet ﷺ taught the virtue of raising girls and taught us how to have affection for daughters. And the Prophet ﷺ gave women rights, which included their status in terms of their property rights and their rights to inheritance. So the general point here is that the values behind the hijab are about a woman not being objectified in this way. So the type of hijab clothing which is worn, it doesn't have to be color specific, and it's just about the fact that it mustn't be the kind of color which is going to be a source of undue attention, unwelcome attention. So within this sort of structure, there's a whole breadth of different types. Ji.
Just to follow on from that,
Ji.
There's been multiple questions about dress code.
Yeah.
Just going to give the viewers a
Dress code, okay. So now, with reference to men and women, in yesterday's gathering, in yesterday's sort of session, we were talking about masculinity in Islam, and to continue that theme in response to today's question about dress code for men and women. For men, one point I'd like to make, this is kind of following from yesterday. In Islam, it's one thing to be tidy and to keep yourself well groomed, and it's another to be obsessive about this. And in Islam, the tradition and the sunnah is that while you keep yourself well groomed and you keep yourself clean, you do not become obsessed with your beautification. In fact, the actual adab for a man is that he combs his hair every other day. And if he has hair which needs to be combed every day, he's allowed to do this. But it's not about constantly being in front of the mirror and sort of being obsessed with every hair follicle. This isn't the teaching for men in Islam. It's more about being in your natural state, but being clean and keeping yourself well in an orderly way. But not to obsess with this is not something which Islam recommends. So the cleanliness is there, the personal hygiene is there, and this is there for men and women. The surplus hair which is removed. For men, the underarm and the pubic hair for men and women, the paring of the nails, and for men it's the beard as well, which needs to be maintained, which needs to be grown and lengthened, and the trimming of the mustache. And for women, they can remove the facial hair, any facial hair that may grow, but they're not supposed to pluck their eyebrows. Now, so with reference to women, there is no restriction in terms of color and self-beautification, but this is not for public display. This is for her own spouse, in her own circle, in her own family situation. And there is a distinction about the different levels of hijab for a woman. There's the hijab which she will have for her own family members, how much she would cover and how much she would cover publicly. So a few general points. There are some areas which we need to be very clear about. Men, for example, are not allowed to wear gold as jewelry. It's not permissible for men. And men aren't allowed to wear silk. It's not permissible. It's haram for men to wear silk. Yes, a little bit. For example, you're wearing a garment and there's a strip of silk which has been stitched on. That's permissible for a man. But to wear a silk garment isn't permissible. And certain colors are not recommended. See, there's an interesting discussion here about the color red for men. Traditionally, muza'far, za'faran, saffron would be used to color garments. It's an orangey reddish color. So mu'asfar, a red yellow kind of color. So men are not supposed to wear red, but there's an exception made here because the Prophet ﷺ is described as being in a red shawl. But the ulama, the Hanafi ulama, say the detail of that is that this particular shawl and garment, it wasn't red out and out, this garment. It had red stripes and threads inside it, and that much is okay. So in general, the women on the other hand are allowed to wear all colors. There's no restriction there. And when we talk about covering your body, the rule for men and women is that the amount which is necessary to cover should be covered with clothing which is neither thin, I just referred to this a little earlier, such that you can see through it, nor so sparse that it doesn't fully cover, and nor so tight that it reveals the body shape. Now, this is becoming the norm now amongst men as well. And from an Islamic point of view, we ought to be aware that to wear very tight jeans, very tight joggies, so that your shape is revealed and the shape of your private parts, it will not be permissible. It's not permissible in Islam to wear clothing like that. And your salah will not be permissible either, because you won't be properly covered. So covering yourself doesn't just mean that there's clothing over your body. It also means that the contours of the body should also be concealed. So this sort of, we're heading towards a society in which it's becoming very normal, sort of popular culture of wearing clothing which clings to your body form. It's not something which is recommended with the parts of the purpose of, even with your upper body for a man. I mean, a man's awrah, the bit he has to cover, is from beneath the navel to beneath the knees. But this is the amount he has to cover. This doesn't then mean that he doesn't cover anything else. We look at the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would keep his whole body covered. And even in ihram, you see the man, the whole body is covered. When you expose the right shoulder, this is for a particular reason. The Sahaba had returned from a battle. In Makkah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted them to show that their morale was high and they were in good physical form. So this was the army march which was performed in the tawaf, and it continues to be the sunnah. But that's the exception. It's only in the tawaf, not through the whole hajj. So the two sheets of ihram too, they cover you from your neck all the way to your ankles. So even when the Prophet ﷺ was wearing two sheets, which was often, sometimes he'd be wearing a thawb, a jubbah, and the izar underneath, and sometimes he'd be just wearing two sheets. Even then, the whole body would be covered. And this is why it's not the norm, it's an exception. We have the example of when Ja'far at-Tayyar radiyallahu anhu, the Prophet ﷺ's cousin, Sayyidina Ali's brother, he returns, and the Prophet ﷺ is so excited to meet him that he rises up quickly and the shawl slips from his shoulder and he receives Ja'far radiyallahu anhu and embraces him. Now this is an exception, that's why it's mentioned in hadith. Normally the Prophet ﷺ would be fully covered. So if you have clothing, Sahaba, the Ashabul Sufa, because of poverty at that time, the Muhajirin often didn't have a lot of clothing. So some of them would have just one large sheet and they would cover themselves as best as they could. And some of them, their upper body would be uncovered because clothing wasn't available. But this wasn't something which they did per choice. So when you have clothing available to cover your arms as well, to cover your head as well, the Prophet ﷺ would have an oil, he would oil his hair, so he'd have a cloth over his hair so that the oil of his hair wouldn't go into his head covering. And above the cloth, which is described like the cloth of an oil presser. In the profession, when people press oil, any cloth that they use is going to get covered with oil as part of the process. So it would be soaked with oil, and it would protect the hat on top of the cloth, and then the turban will be on top of that. So to have your head covered is sunnah. And although it's permissible not to cover your head, it's not the normal dress code of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's not his ordinary habit. So to have yourself covered, and to cover yourself from top to bottom with loose clothing, and clothing is zina in the terminology of the Quran. And for sisters, the awrah is the full body in front of non-mahrams, with the exception of the hands and feet. And with reference to the face, there's a difference of opinion. The three Imams, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad, Imam Shafi, all say the face has to be covered. And in the Hanafi position too, the fuqaha say that where there's a danger of fitna, it ought to be covered. That is the classical position, and it's the position today of the ulama across the ummah. So this is the ideal situation. So we need to get as close to that as possible. Now with reference to the rest of the garments, we've already mentioned clothing should be loose And this means that the contours of the body shouldn't be exposed. And clothing should be enough to cover everything. It should be, and it should be covering the whole area which is necessary to cover. And so the traditional head garment, today we have a situation where head scarves are used for covering the head and sometimes tied behind the shoulders. The actual instruction in the Quran, yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihin, includes covering the chest as well. This is all part and parcel of the hijab of Islam, covering the head and the chest. So I've given you some indications here. I mean, it's a longer subject. I hope it's of some use. I think one of the other important aspects to remember is tashabbuh. So it's true that the Prophet ﷺ, la'anallahu al-mutashabbihin, he cursed those men who imitate women and those women who imitate men. So the Islamic value system is such that your gender identity is something which you should be asserting and maintaining. Ji.
My parents don't want me to marry a Muslim girl that is of different race or culture than my family. How should I go about this?
My family don't want me to marry a Muslim girl who's of a different race or culture.
Yes.
How should I go about this? This is a major challenge in our community today, where families don't see eye to eye, generational differences when it comes to marriage. It's not something which you can sort of click your finger and resolve, and everybody has unique circumstances. So the ideal situation would of course be that you marry with the blessing of your parents, and early on in your teens perhaps there ought to be dialogue, there ought to be communication from the parents and from young people, and both sides need to have the confidence to converse with one another. This communication is important. What happens is, even if parents are thinking about marrying their children, when they don't discuss it with the children have no idea. And sometimes parents are just too sort of laid back on this, and they're not in any rush whatsoever. And this is a problem. Parents ought to be proactive, and there ought to be a discussion. Now, the person who's going to get married, it has the last say. And that's what Islam says. If you're getting married, it's your choice whether to say yes or no. And you shouldn't be forced to make a decision, and it's not healthy for the marriage. We see too many examples where young people go into a marriage to appease their parents' decision, and then it doesn't work out. Having said this, think about it, flip the coin and look at it from the other side. When your parents recommend someone for you, it's probably for your benefit as well. So they're not always wrong. So the general point is, let us get to the table, so to speak, and let there be some dialogue. And this can be a very touchy subject for young people and parents alike. But we need to sort of break the ice, and we need to find ways of communicating. And in different families, the dynamics are different. So as a young man, for example, the question is coming from a brother, you might find that you can't talk to your dad, you might be able to talk to your mum. Or vice versa, you can talk to your dad, you can't talk to your mum. So talk to the parent that you can talk to, and that parent can then talk to the other parent. And similarly, sometimes it's through one of your siblings. So you may have a sister who has the ear of your mother. So and vice versa. So you need to find a way of establishing communication. Now, the question, if we just simplified it and objectified it, and we assume that there are no other dynamics here, that your parents don't want you to marry someone who's not from the same race and culture, you're talking about someone who's from the same family background. Well, kuf is important in Islam, but it's not obligatory. But the problem is that the criteria of kuf does shift. And so while your close relatives, kuf is being compatible in terms of social and religious background. And when we say religious background, we're talking about being from the same religion, of course, but we're talking about being from the same level of piety and so forth. Yep. So basically, this kind of compatibility. Now, what happens is, if your parents were born abroad and you were brought up here, then sometimes there's a great disparity between close relatives. They may be seen to be kuf, but it depends on your upbringing. Even though you may have grown up here, if you were brought up in a traditional way and you have traditional values and you've kept links with your homeland, and in your homeland, your near relatives, you can pretty much get along with them, then it may be a good option for you. On the other hand, if the East is the East and the West is the West, and never shall the twain meet, the situation is such that you're a complete different, that you're heading in a completely different direction, then there's no wisdom in this, and parents ought to understand this too. So yeah, marrying from your own kind of background is actually wise. It's something which is recommended, and parents ought to be acknowledged when they wish this for their children, but it's not a condition. It's not necessary, and you certainly don't have to marry a relative. But this isn't, see, I want to correct something here as well. A popular misgiving. With young people now, there's a stigma in marrying people from your relations. If that were true, Allah Azza wa Jal wouldn't have mentioned this to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Banati ammatik, your cousins from your father's side and your cousins from your mother's side. Allah Azza wa Jal mentions these as ideal matches for Rasulullah in the Quran. So this idea of a problem with marrying cousins is not correct. It's not correct. It's perfectly valid in Islam. It's not wrong. It's not morally wrong, and it's not something which Allah has disapproved of for His own Prophet, His choicest messenger, the greatest of the messengers. So this isn't. So we need to keep this in mind. So let's not. It's not something to laugh about, as people do and make and poke fun at. Having said this, if you don't want to marry from your sort of near family circle, then that's perfectly permissible for you too. But it's appropriate to achieve the blessings of your parents. Now, let me just make a distinction here. And it's like, see, there are two scenarios. One scenario is that, I don't know how old you are. Let's suppose you're like in your early 20s, for example, and this is your initial sort of early stages of when you're trying to find a spouse. Well, there's still time now, isn't there, to talk. Whom you marry is preventing any forward movement, any progression, then you may have to take a stance. You may have to take a stance, assuming that you've already worked with sincerity in coming to the sort of same page with your parents, and you've listened to them and they listen to you, and it's not going to happen, then you may have to take a stance. Now, what I say in this situation is that if you want to get married to someone and you do so, do with their blessing of you should take the permission of the walis of the girl, the awliya of the girl, so that she has her family support, because if she doesn't have that family support, there's a difference of opinion in here, although the Hanafi position is flexible here. It's not ideal. But on top of that, she'll need that sponge when you are in your married life. It's not appropriate that she doesn't have a support network behind her as well. Because you might be the person who becomes the baddie in the marriage. So what happens then? So there are benefits. And then when the children come along, they ought to be able to see their grandparents and their cousins, and if you've broken ties with your own family. So there's going to be a problem. So if you do take that stance, so here's what I say. If you marry someone against the will of your parents, and then your parents, as you would expect, become very unhappy with you, then don't respond in the same way. Even if they say unpleasant things to you, don't respond in the same way. And don't break ties with them. Continue to have a soft spot for them, because you're their flesh and blood, and accept that they can have those feelings for you, and make a resolution that you're going to work hard to re-establish that relationship, no matter how long it takes, and win them over. Win them over, so that there comes a situation where they've actually accepted you again and welcomed you back. So that's going to be the solution there. Ji.
Murdy's question as it is, I'm not sure. So, what age do the ulama usually say that qaza umri starts?
What age does qaza umri start? As soon as you reach the age of puberty.
What's qaza umri, Manasa?
Any salah that you've missed needs to be repeated. It's a debt in your name. You have to make it up. And this is established from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. In order to demonstrate to us what Allah wants from us, many things happened to the Prophet ﷺ for our benefit, so we could get an example from him. One occasion, the Sahaba are traveling, and Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu anhu takes the responsibility of waking everybody up, and the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba go to sleep. And Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu anhu, having taken the responsibility, he sits with his back to the camel and his face facing the east, watching the horizon, and he falls asleep until the heat of the sun wakes him up. And he comes to the Prophet ﷺ, he says, Ya Rasulullah, what made you sleep? The one that made you sleep made me sleep as well. And so the Prophet ﷺ rises and the Sahaba move along to a slightly different place because they don't want to stay in a place in which this unblessed event has happened. And the Prophet ﷺ leads them in the mist prayer. On the other occasion, the Prophet ﷺ is digging the trench for Ghazwa. The battle of the trenches, Ghazwa Ahzab, Ghazwa of Ahzab, and Ghazwa Khandaq. And because of the intensity of this moment, the Sahaba are suffering from starvation, they're hungry. The Prophet ﷺ has 2 stones tied to his belly, and the digging is intense, and the weather is severe. And the armies, it's a coalition of forces with the Mushrikeen of Makkah. They've sided with many others, including the Persians, and they're marching on Medina. And so it's about defending the city with the trench. And so all the Sahaba have their small groups, and the Prophet ﷺ is constantly engaged in this digging. And what happens is several prayers are missed because of this urgency. And the Prophet ﷺ makes them up with the Sahaba. So missed prayers have to be made up. Qada Umri is when you look back in your life and you see that you've missed many, many prayers and they need to be made up. So you make an informed calculation, and then one by one you take them off. It's for your Umr, for your life, all that you've missed in your fard prayers and what are your wajib prayers. So when do you have to do them? Well, as soon as. So ideally, there's 2 types of people with qada. There's the sahib al-tartib who is up to date. And for such a person, he has to perform his most recently missed prayer first until 5. If it's beyond that, then he can continue with the next prayers and make these up later. Otherwise, if you've only missed one prayer, for example, ever, then the next prayer isn't valid until you've performed the one that's still due. And if you've missed many prayers, which might be weeks, months, whatever, years, when you came to start performing prayer regularly, you should make an informed calculation, maybe make a chart. There's probably an app available these days, or you can just use your phone diary, and you can start taking it off by making the intention of performing the most recently missed Fajr and the most recently missed Dhuhr, or the one that was missed first, the other end of the time period. And so what happens is the same intention will then say, if I make an intention, the most recently missed Fajr, and then I make the same intention again, because one's been ticked off, it'll be the one previous to that, until you're satisfied that you've achieved everything that you had missed. And this amounts to 20 rakats of one day. There's the 2 of Fajr and 4 of Dhuhr and 4 of Asr, which is 10, and there's the 3 of Maghrib and the 7 of Isha, 3 plus 4, the 3 witr as well. So this is a total of 20 rakats, and one way that it can be done is that with every fard prayer you perform, you just perform another 2, an extra 2 with Fajr, and 2 or 4 or 3, and 4 with Dhuhr and so forth. So that each day you're covering for one day. That's one approach which you can take. And you can use these rakats instead of nafil rakats. You can perform them at tahajjud time as well, until you've covered everything. So yeah, you do have to, and when? At the earliest opportunity. Ji.
I talked about Ruqya yesterday, but
Yeah.
somebody's asked that I've been advised that jinns come out at this time, and that scares me. Is that true?
I've been advised that jinns come out at this time, and that scares me. Let jinns come out whenever they wish. They have their world and we have ours. Allah has made them invisible for us, and thank God. Or do you want to see them? I'm not going to show you any. So basically, just like other creations which we don't see. You know, if we read our du'as when we enter our houses and say salam, Allahumma inni as'aluka khayr al-mawlaj wa khayr al-makhraj, bismillahi walajna wa bismillahi kharajna wa ala Allahi tawakkalna. Read this dua and we say salam when we enter our house, and then when we leave our house, bismillahi tawakkaltu ala Allah wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. It's sufficient. Read your Ayatul Kursi, stay in the state of wudu. Let me tell you something interesting. You know, there was a book lying about here in the masjid some years ago, and it's Hiwar. It's a journalistic interview. It was an Arabic book. A journalistic interview with Mustafa Kanchus. This is the name of a jinn apparently. And the interviewer managed to talk to him. Don't start asking me for this book now. Right? So basically in the book, the jinn is talking to the interviewer. And he's asking him, the man is asking the jinn, is that they mind their own business and we mind our own, and you're the superior creation. That's why the Anbiya came from the human beings. And if you're not afraid of them, then they're afraid of you. You know, they say that the bark is worse than the bite. The small dog barks the loudest. So you can be chased by a very small dog. The large dog doesn't need to bark. So it's very similar. If you are scary cat, as they say, and the smallest creaking of the hinge in your door makes you jump and scream, then jinns might take advantage of that and poke fun at you. So rather the other way around, you can say, look, I'm master of the house, it's my house, how dare any uninvited guests come in, and nothing will happen. So don't worry your head too much, and don't be afraid, because the Muslim is not afraid, and that's sufficient. It's not something to pursue and to be paranoid about. There are many creations of Allah. وَمَا يَعْلَمُ جُنُودَ رَبِّكَ إِلَّا هُوَ. They manage their affairs, we manage ours. Ji.
There's quite a few questions coming on Eid and Eid Salah, but we'll get to them closer to the
Okay, yeah. So your queries about Eid and Eid Salah, inshallah, at the end of the week in our Friday session, we'll talk about Eid, inshallah. Ji.
Does fidya money have to be spent on food or meals for the needy, or can it be used for some other purpose, like medicine?
Does fidya money have to be used for food? That's what it is originally. It is food. It should be used to feed poor people. You've asked about medicine. I can't comment on that yet. I'll have to come back to that. In normal circumstances, no. In normal circumstances, no, it should be food. There may be exceptions. I'll have to come back to that one. Ji.
Can fitrana fall under zakat?
Can fitrana
Fall under zakat?
fall under zakat? Fitrana is a type of zakat. Another name for fitrana, sadaqatul fitr, is also called zakatul fitr. But when you say fall under zakat, it's calculated separately, and if when you've paid your zakat, you still do your fitrana. The difference between the two, a couple of differences. One is that for zakat, you need the passage of a whole year. So you need to have been above the threshold at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year. For fitrana, the only day that counts is the day of Eid. If you are in possession of that amount on the day of Eid, then you have to give it. 1. And 2, it's given on behalf of the minors in the family as well. It's given on behalf of all your children. So the people you give it to are very similar. It's just that you give it to the same categories of people that you would give zakat to. Ji.
Is it permissible for Muslims to take mortgages?
Is it permissible to take mortgages for Muslims? Interest, giving and taking interest are both not allowed in Islam. So, of course, this begs the question, doesn't it? So what do you do? Well, why do you rely on loans? Why not, the old saying, cut your coat according to your cloth? I was with, I used to use black cabs, these taxis, very frequently. And we'd have some interesting conversations. What would happen is the driver would see that I'm coming to the masjid, and he'd strike up a conversation, and I'd find many retired professionals from different backgrounds driving cabs. And this particular cab driver, he started talking about values, and he says, look, I bought this cab, and cabs are worth a lot of money, tens of thousands of pounds, with every penny from my own pocket. I saved up for it. And he says, that's what I teach my children. When they ever ask for anything, I say, look, don't buy anything that you can't afford. Don't buy things on credit. This is a non-Muslim speaking. He says, look, you save up. And that's the point. In the first instance, buy what you can afford. And what you can't, don't desire it. And thereafter, if you need to make a bigger investment, then the actual teaching of Islam, the spirit of Islam, Islamic society, values, economics, finances in Islam, is that we support one another. So Zayd borrows from Abdullah and he writes it down. That's another mistake that we make. And it's dated and there are witnesses and it's paid back on time. And if you can't pay it back on time, by all means, Shaykh Zakaria rahimullah, when his father passed away, he inherited a lot of debt. So he concerned himself, and he was in his late teens at the time, very young. He concerned himself with paying everybody off. And in order to achieve this, he established a bookshop, a business as well. And what he would do is he would borrow money to pay money off without without interest from people he knew. And what he would do is, he says, I always paid money off on time. So if I borrowed some money from Zayd, because I now needed to pay Abdullah an installment and I didn't have the money, I would make sure that when it came for me to pay Zayd, if I didn't have any money to pay him, I would borrow from somebody else. And he says, I never ever missed a date. And the consequence was that the various people I would request, they began to trust me in a big way. So I could readily get debt. And Sheikh says, in my lifetime, all my affairs have been run on debt. And Sheikh used to live like a king. And when I say lived like a king, not that he himself he had a very simple lifestyle, he ate very little and wore very simple clothing, but he would have huge numbers of guests. When I say huge, I'm talking about hundreds at times. And he would have he would have a very lavish sort of, his hospitality would be of a regal class, you know. It would be royalty. He'd have guests from the Arab world and other countries. And so he would happily spend openly. And he would send gifts to the mashayikh and to others. And he would travel. But the point is, he would always pay off. And Allah gave him a lot of barakah in this. So the point is, when you do need to, now there's benefits here. If you borrow money only when you have to, unfortunately, the offer to take something on credit is around you everywhere. Finance, you know, schemes everywhere when you go into a store or online. But if you avoid that and you buy what's necessary, and when you need to buy something and you don't have the money, then you borrow just as much as is necessary after having made a true intention to pay it back, a true commitment. Then what happens is it brings you down as well. There are benefits as well, because you won't spoil yourself. You know you have to face this person and answer to Allah as well. And then what happens is pay it on time. Whatever happens, pay on time. And don't make false promises. So I shouldn't say I'll pay you in 2 months when I know I can't. This is another problem. And another tip I would give you is, when you borrow money, make the intention of paying it back. Agree to pay it back in installments if the other person will accept. Because you may not have the lump sum when the time comes. So this is the ideal situation. Now, when you pay it back, you get the reward for paying it back and fulfilling your promise. And when the person lends it to you, they get the reward of sadaqah. And for the person who gives it to you, the advice is that if they can at all, and you're struggling, they should let a little bit off. And if they can't do that, then they give you extra time. But they don't have to do any of these things. And they are entitled to demand it from you. The problem is, some people think that as soon as they borrow debt, that's it. Apna kaam ho gaya, and that's it. End of story. That's the wrong attitude. So in the first instance, don't borrow. And if you do have to, borrow from each other. And let's have a society in which people support each other. And people don't want to because people let them down. So don't let people down. And the other point is, this is another subject, I suppose. We'll have to come back to it. The whole question of mortgages here is because people want to invest in property. I think we'll deal with that on a separate occasion, because that'll take a few minutes as well. Yeah, but I think I've just touched on the essential question here.
So it pays to have a good credit profile?
Sorry?
So it pays to have a good credit profile?
It pays to have a good credit profile, absolutely. And that is with friends, when we borrowing and lending to each other. Ji.
Just to follow on from that, what is the punishment of unpaid debt?
Punishment of unpaid debt. You know, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the early stages of Islam, he refused to perform the janazah of someone who owed money. On one occasion, a Sahabi passed away, and the Prophet learned that he had debt, and he was about not to perform his janazah. Imagine the loss of barakah here, if that had happened. And another Sahabi realized, and he offered to pay on his behalf, and then the Prophet performed his janazah. So this is serious. The problem is that when you don't pay in the dunya, you'll have to pay in the akhirah if it's not forgiven by the other person. And paying in the akhirah will be with your good deeds. And if there's none left, you'll have to take their sins on your shoulder. So you want to avoid this at all costs. You want to avoid this at all costs. Ji.
When you give zakat, do you have to inform the person you're giving it to?
When you give zakat, do you have to inform the person you're giving it to? No, and you actually shouldn't. Why embarrass them? You can present it as though it were a gift. Ji.
We're running out of time. It's the final question, then
Mhm.
we'll cover the
Yeah.
next week. We are doing Ramadan on different days in our house. What should we do about Eid? And secondly, is there any way of doing Eid on the same day in Glasgow?
We are doing Ramadan on different days in our house. Just one different day. What should we do for Eid? Well, that's your choice, isn't it? What can I say? You made the decision to do it on different days. That wasn't our recommendation. You could have united as a family. If you can't unite as a family, you expect the city to unite for your sake. For Eid, we will try our best. And who knows, we may have Eid together anyway, and then your problem will be solved. Inshallah. Ji.
That's us finished in time.
Okay. May Allah accept. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah.